Okay, welcome everyone. I'm David Rammel, editor of Virtualization and Cloud Review, here to moderate our first session as well as welcome you to our Microsoft 365 Security Summit, brought to you by Commvault, Mimecast, Cohesity, Druva, and Barracuda. Before we start today's three-session event, we do have some announcements. First, we wanted to let you know this event is being recorded and will be available for future viewing. You will receive an email when the replay is available, generally within the next few days. Also, each of today's three sessions will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A. So please be sure to put your questions into the Q&A area of your console as they come up so we can get them answered for you by our experts. And during today's third session, we will be giving away a Nintendo Switch. But you must be present to win, so be sure to stay on for the entire event. Finally, we do have resources from our sponsors Commvault, Mimecast, Cohesity, Druva, and Barracuda available on the console right now, so please download and check those out. It's because of them underwriting this summit that we can bring you this great content, so we thank them for supporting the community and ask you to check out those resources so we can bring you more events in the future. And last but not least, please check out the Resource Center for more information on our upcoming live 360 training conference in Orlando this November, with over 170 sessions and 16 hands-on labs. Now on to the first session of today's summit, Microsoft 365 Security, Top Installation, Configuration, and Management Mistakes and Gotchas. This session features Derek Melber, 19-time Microsoft MVP. He is president of BrainCore, where he provides consulting services, leveraging his 25-plus years of worldwide keynote speaking, authoring 18 books, consulting, and enterprise advising around Microsoft solutions and identity security. As a 19-time Microsoft MVP, leveraging extensive experience in unifying products, marketing, sales, and content, he assists organizations to achieve success and exceed company goals around identity, security, and enterprise IT administration. Derek, it's great to have you here. Please take it away.
Thank you so much, David. I appreciate it. And thanks to Redmond for having me, and thanks to all the sponsors. What a great lineup of sponsors. As you kind of mentioned, yes, I work for my own company, BrainCore, but I'm also kind of helping different organizations. One of them is Manager, and I appreciate their support as well. So as you see here, as I start off with this slide, you kind of see some blasts from the past there. I kind of jokingly pulled out this Securing Windows Server 2003 book, because as everyone can probably imagine, not a big seller. But, you know, many of you may actually have the resource kit, the group policy resource kit on your desk or somewhere. And that was certainly kind of a claim to fame on that one. But, you know, I'll mention it now, and I'll also mention it at the end. If you do have any questions that you think of after the session, please don't hesitate to reach out to me and ask any questions. I'm here for that. That's how I'm a 19-time Microsoft MVP. I think we have someone else speaking today that's also over a 20-time MVP. So you have quite a bit of experience here, and we're more than happy to help you as much as possible with answering any of your questions. So without further ado, let's just kind of jump into what we're going to talk about today, which is Microsoft 365 security. And I definitely want to, you know, create the playing field, because I ask a lot of different questions to organizations around what they have to help them solve problems. And one of the things that I constantly ask is, do you have Azure AD, or now what's referred to as Intra ID? And many of them say, no, we don't have that. And then I ask, well, do you have Microsoft 365? And they say, well, sure. And it's very confusing, the fact that you actually have to have Intra ID in order to have Microsoft 365, or what it used to be called Office 365. So this is certainly something that is kind of a trick, in opinion. Microsoft kind of fools you a little bit. When you try to administer what I'm going to be showing you here, you kind of have to dig around to find certain things. And it gets a little more confusing when maybe you've been using Azure AD and now you have to go and use Intra ID because Microsoft certainly shuffled the deck. But let's kind of walk through some things that I think are critical for administrators and organizations to understand when you get going with Microsoft 365 and also when you just try to get things done, because not everything is obvious, right? And what we're going to talk about with Microsoft 365 initially here, and we're going to jump around a little bit, is we're going to first of all talk about MFA, right? I think everyone understands the importance of MFA, even though there are some gotchas with MFA, right? I mean, we've all seen the news and seen how attackers have tricked employees into clicking on things maybe they shouldn't have clicked on, and it caused some issues. But still at the core, MFA is extremely important. Also, I think it's important to talk about inactive users. What we don't want is someone to be just connected constantly if they're not using the cloud capabilities. So what we want to do is make sure that we kind of control that activity. Yes, we do have to still talk about passwords, and I'm going to talk about those. And yes, if we have MFA, we still are going to have passwords, and there's a whole area about passwordless, right? I was actually reading something that Microsoft posted about passwordless. But I think, in my view anyway, we're not going to be able to get rid of on-prem Active Directory anytime soon. We're not going to be able to 100% get rid of passwords anytime soon because we still have accounts in the environment that need passwords. So we need to talk about passwords. And then I want to talk a little bit about inside of what you can see in Microsoft 365 with security score and some other things around that. So first and foremost, let's talk about MFA. I'm sorry? Oh, I think that was just something snuck in there. So with MFA, right, and you'll notice I have a little secret decoder ring here. So M365 would be in the Microsoft 365 portal, and EID would be the Intra ID or even Azure AD portal, right? Again, if you're inside of Intra ID versus Azure AD, you kind of have to go to different locations. It is not mimicking the same structure. So if you are using Azure AD and you're trying to use some of the little paths that I give you here and Intra ID, it most likely is not the same path. So just wanted to warn you up front about that. But what you notice here for MFA, there's actually multiple ways that you can configure MFA, right? So for those of you that are kind of more Microsoft 365 centric and really don't even use Azure AD or Intra ID portal, you know that you can go and configure MFA per user, right? Now, according to Microsoft, this is kind of the legacy way of doing things, right? This was kind of what Microsoft created to begin with. And they're actually recommending that you don't use this anymore. Instead, they want you to use your conditional access policies. So when you see CAP, I've kind of shortened that to conditional access policies. And definitely, in my opinion, I think conditional access policies are fantastic, right? So if you currently are using the Microsoft 365 portal and you've been configuring MFA per user, I think you're better off to actually move over towards the conditional access policies inside of Intra ID so that you can configure them a little bit better, right? You're going to be able to have much more granularity around the applications they're using, who exactly you're going to use MFA for, when you're going to use MFA. There's a lot more control around that. And so you'll see that's my third bullet point here, which is conditional access policies. Right? You get to customize this. Now, out of the box, this gets a little confusing, and I'm going to talk about this down the road today as well, but the security defaults, right? are enabled depending on when you engaged with Microsoft 365 and Azure AD, right? There is a time frame in which Microsoft didn't have security policies enabled. So depending on where you are, you may have to go double check that. And I'm going to get to that a little bit later on in this session. But for now, we're just kind of focusing directly on MFA itself. So conditional access policies and intra-ID are not there by default. There are none configured, okay? So you're kind of going back to this security default, right, in intra-ID, which kind of controls your users and when MFA is used or not, okay? Now, the security defaults enable MFA for all users, including enrollment, right? So it's going to push them through the enrollment, and it's going to enable MFA for all of them. What's interesting is Microsoft, with the security default policy, controls when MFA is triggered. It's kind of behind the scenes. It's using what Microsoft calls as kind of their database of knowledge, and they're going to control when MFA triggers for your employees. This could be a normal user or an administrator, okay? Which, again, I kind of am going to suggest that you have more control over that. So you can go to the conditional access policy route, okay? Now, Microsoft is constantly changing. Of course, they renamed Azure AD to Intra ID, and they're adding additional capabilities constantly. So this moves things around. So you'll notice down here, I have an entry called Modern Authentication. This is a Microsoft 365 term, right? And you'll notice that it can't work with security defaults enabled, nor can conditional access policies. So basically, you have security default policy, or you're going to go down to conditional access policy or modern authentication, kind of one or those two. I'm going to push you down the conditional access policy route. I think that is a best practice. You have more control, but you do have the ability to not have to go into Intra ID, and you can go just the Microsoft 365 route, and that way you stay within that portal, that configuration portal, and this is the path where you would go for that, okay? So, summary about MFA. Depending on when you engaged or not, it might be enabled automatically through your security default policy. If it was before that, you may not have MFA configured, and you definitely want to go in and look at these controls and look at these configurations, okay? And my best practice recommendation is use the conditional access policies as much as possible, because they give you that ultimate control and they give you that power. All right, let's move on to the next step. There is a way to actually sign out inactive users, right? This is what you see in the interface here is the idle session timeout. And so you get to go in and control if someone just wants to connect and stay connected. Well, after a certain amount of time of them not functioning in the interface, you're going to actually cut them off. And you can see here in the drop-down, you have quite a few options, anywhere from an hour all the way to, a full day. But you can also do a customization of that, which is kind of nice that Microsoft gives us this. Again, we don't want connectivity constantly because of attack scenarios, because it's going to cost us money, because there's many reasons behind that, which is why Microsoft gives us this type of control, so we can control kind of the environment and when and where we want users to stay connected, or when we basically want to kind of eliminate their connectivity and then have to reconnect. All right, next, something that I think is extremely important, which is passwords. And this gets extremely confusing, in my opinion, when you start considering the fact that you have your users in Intra ID, which is where the password policy is. And then most of you most likely have a hybrid Active Directory environment, okay? So with a hybrid Active Directory environment, now the game really changes. So let's talk about what is there by default, and let's talk about kind of what you have options to control. So the default user password policy in Intra ID has an 8-character minimum, 256-character maximum. Yes, that is not a typo, right? That's actually what it has been for on-prem AD as well. You have to use 3 or 4 characters, right? Types. This is that complexity requirement that we're all familiar with from on-prem AD. And then the password expiration is never expire, okay? Now, pre-2021 is it's set to 90 days. Now, we're going to get into this never expire thing because I definitely have my own opinion here, as I'm sure many people have their opinion on this. And I'll give you exactly why I have my opinion on this, okay? Now, it's also important to understand the change history and the reset history because it's a little different than what it is for on-prem, which we had this, I'm going to remember X number of passwords before. So when you're changing your password, the last password can't be used again. And then, I forgot my password, I'm going to reset it. The last password can be used again. So this is kind of a strange ism, especially for those of us that are more familiar with other identity and access management platforms where they have a history that's there. So this is kind of the out-of-the-box experience that your users are going to experience with their password, okay? Now, I really like this diagram, and I wanted to kind of walk you through this. So we start in the upper left-hand corner, and this is the decision tree of which password policy do I get. As I mentioned, you do have the password policy that I just went over inside of Intra ID, but you could be using the on-prem Active Directory password policy options depending on how you get through them, okay? So let's talk about this, right? Is the account an on-prem account or an Azure AD authoritative account, right? If it's Azure AD, then you're going to go the Azure AD component because, you don't even have hybrid environment. You don't have the on-prem AD. But if you do have on-prem AD, let's go down that path because I think this is the more complex path, right? If you have a hybrid and you're using on-prem, then you're going to look at, does the default account policy apply? Well, this may or may not be exactly correct as it's written because the point is, are you using PSOs, which is password setting object? So this is the fine-grained password policy, okay? So if you have engaged fine-grained password policy and you're configured that for a user, they're going to use that path with on-prem. If you didn't do that, then you're either going to use the default domain policy or, believe it or not, and I know this is a big kind of shock for many people, you do not have to use the default domain policy for the password policy. You can actually create another GPO, link it to the domain, give it a higher precedence in the default domain policy, and now the password policy in that GPO will apply, which is why down here it says, is there another GPO password policy? Okay? So this is where this complexity kind of overrides, oh my gosh, what am I actually getting? Which is why you need to test this. You need to go in and make sure that users are getting the correct password policy because it may be a regulation. It might be something internal. You want to make sure that your service accounts or your administrator accounts have a certain password policy for security purposes, and it is a little confusing. Okay. Now let's move and talk about some of the controls around passwords. Inside of Intra ID, there's something called the lockout threshold and duration, kind of similar to what you had for on-prem AD. But new inside of Intra ID that started with Azure AD are a custom band password list, okay? Now, Microsoft provides their own list, and that list is dynamic. It's kind of behind the scenes, and Microsoft is constantly paying attention to passwords, and they try to put the top passwords in their list. But let's say, for example, that you work for the Acme company, and you don't want anyone to use Acme company as a password, so you can put that in your own custom band password list, okay? So you have more controls inside of intra ID by default than what you had in on-prem AD, primarily with this banned password list and how they control that, okay? Now, password expiration. NIST and Microsoft say never expire a password. I don't agree with that, okay? The reason I don't agree with that is because the fine print behind them saying that is that you are going to eliminate on-prem AD, and you are only going to be using Azure AD, which is when they came up with this, or Intra ID, which does allow for MFA. Some of the other gotchas with this, which is why I say you have to have passwords expire, is you don't want your administrators, right, not expiring the password, and you also don't want your service accounts not expiring the password. So those are some reasons why I say, all right, make the passwords long and strong and give it 180 to 360 days. I'm not saying change it every month, but what I am saying is we have to have passwords expire because of the nature of the beast, right? And the beast being, in my opinion, well, we have some users that are going to use passwords and they can't always use MFA, okay? It may be service accounts, but then again, that's why it's kind of set there. Now, you can actually set individual users to not expire within Microsoft Graph, and I've given you the example of what that would look like here. So this kind of gives you the ability to say, okay, I'm going to configure it globally, and then I can set individual users to have it different, okay? So this is kind of the little differences that you have now that we've moved away from on-prem and we're kind of in this Microsoft 365 and Intra ID world. And yes, the users for Microsoft 365 have to be in Intra ID or Azure AD. There's no other option. All right, let's talk about Smart Lockout. Smart Lockout is basically Microsoft's way of prohibiting someone from just pounding accounts and being able to get into the account. So 10 unsuccessful logon attempts with an incorrect password is a 1-minute lockout, right? Then they kind of torture either you if you can't remember your password or the attackers because each additional incorrect sign-in actually increases the time in which the lockout is there. So this is a little unique and different compared to what we're familiar with. So if you've ever had users complain about this, this may be what's happening to them, and the knowledge of this is very important, okay? Now, Smart Lockout also monitors the last 3 instances of incorrect password entries, right? So this is basically helping to secure this whole idea of being attacked, right? Avoids the escalation of lockout periods for repeated use of the same password, right? So incorrect password versus the same password, now Microsoft is controlling this. And Smart Lockout is just a click, and you can either enable it or not. And this is what it gives you. And really, for the most part, your users shouldn't have to interface with this, right? I mean, how many times do you have a user that's going to really try to put in 10 different passwords? Well, they're going to remember it or they're going to give up before that. That's just what I've seen for the most part. But this is a really good security setting, and I definitely recommend making sure that this is configured. All right. Also inside of Microsoft 365 is you have this identity score, okay? I think this identity score is pretty awesome because it's giving you kind of a summary of things that you need to pay attention to, okay? And in the background, it's comparing to Microsoft best practices, so you don't have to code that. Microsoft is coding that for you, and you basically have security scores for your identity. Obviously, you want the score to go up, not down, but the great thing about it is over time, making sure that at least is maintained if it's meeting a threshold for your organization that you like. And in here, you can look for certain types of activity. So you'll see down below in the screenshot there's improvement actions. So this is where you can go in and you can go through each of them, and based on your time, right, because not everything is the same time to fix, you can go through and say, okay, what's the impact? What is the overall cost? I'm going to go and hopefully, right, the goal is the things that cost the lowest but have the highest impact overall in making the score higher. That's what we want to implement. And so I think this is a really good view, so that now you have a pretty clear understanding of what you need to do and what's possible inside of Intra ID for your identities. And this all goes back to that security score, which is tied again into the Microsoft 365 environment. All right, so I know there was kind of an overlap between some of those things, but I definitely wanted to also focus on some of the things that you have specifically in Intra ID, which is tied to Microsoft 365. Please keep that in mind, right? I know I've said it a couple of times, but to be honest, when I ask so many customers what they have in their environment and they really don't know, that's why I'm kind of pushing that is it is tied together, okay? And you can't have one, you can't have Microsoft 365 without having Intra ID. It is the identity store for that. Okay, so let's jump in here and talk about identity protection. Now, identity protection is something that is configurable, and you basically have these detection risks, which are pretty cool. It's what we definitely want, right? A lot of organizations are pushing this information all the way into their SOC and putting it into the SOC. What Microsoft is doing here is they're actually allowing these types of detections to now be inside of the identity store instead of pushing into the SOC and having the SOC responsible for that. Not saying it won't make it to the SOC. All I'm saying is the great thing is you can actually now control some of these things. For example, password spray attacks. Password spray attacks are very common because most environments are available to the internet. And since they're available, right, now we're going to have these password spray attacks, right? Low and slow, as they're called. So password spray attacks now are going to be investigated and brought to the surface. And the way Microsoft does this is they're actually putting it now into reports basically under risky sign-ins, right? So with these risky sign-ins, you now are going to have reports, and you can do different things with those reports, send them into the SOC, send emails, do some different things with them. And again, I think it's just awesome that Microsoft is putting this inside of the tool, right? You don't have to go in and do much effort to automatically have this for you. But I will point out, right, and there is a distinctive pattern here, right? And I saw someone come across in one of the comments, which is very correct, is conditional access policies aren't available for everyone, right? You have to have a certain level to be able to engage conditional access policies. But what you will see is Microsoft pushing, hey, we recommend migrating stuff from the old way into the new way for conditional access policies. If you do have a level of Intra ID that supports conditional access policies, I would highly recommend using them. If not, well, you're going to have to basically go the old way of doing things or use that default security policy that we were talking about, which does have some great benefits, and I'm going to talk about that in detail in our next little section here, okay? So what you have here is the ability to configure some of these policies, right? So inside of the interface, you have a user risk policy, you have a sign-in risk policy, and you have an MFA registration policy. So this is kind of the front end. This is the configuration piece. You're kind of setting up, okay, what does the policy look like to engage these settings? And then as you have them triggered, you have reports, right? And you have a report that basically matches up with each of your policies. So you have a risky user policy, right? And you see that here. You have risky sign-ins, you have detections, and then also you have remediations, right? Kind of guidance from Microsoft on what you should do with the remediations. So this is a great way to see what's going on, that you don't have to send all this information directly into your SOC. Microsoft is giving you the ability to detect some of these things without having it sent into the SOC. You can still send it into SOC, but you don't have to. What I would encourage you to do is many of these things that I'm showing you, try to create a cadence where you're either having administrators go into these environments, you're having these environments communicate out so that not everybody has to go into the GUI because they don't have time for that. Also, these things are hidden, in my opinion, right? As Intra ID was shaken up from Azure AD, and Microsoft is constantly adding new capabilities and features, it gets a little confusing. So make sure that you create a good communication stream from all of these areas to where you know where they're going to, right? Whether that be into your SOC, into your SIM, or you're actually using the interfaces that Microsoft give you, which you'd have to go in there and look at those for the most part, okay? All right, now let's move on to security default policy. So what you notice here is inside of the Intra ID, and or this is Azure AD, I'm sorry. And you'll notice under properties here, this is where that security default is configured, okay? So I have it disabled here, which is not recommended. So as I go back, let me kind of summarize again what we're looking at. If you have an older Azure AD environment, you may not have security defaults enabled. It was only after, I think it's October 22nd, 2019, that this was enabled by default. Now, if you do have a level of Azure AD that supports conditional access policies, this has to be disabled, right? Because I can't have both. We kind of talked about that before. So security defaults are where you can enable a set of conditions for users that are actually pretty good. And I'm going to go through the details of what the security defaults enable, okay? Now, here it is, October 22nd, 2019 is when security defaults were enabled by default. Microsoft actually enabled them, right? It's kind of like going back to the old world of on-prem AD when Microsoft didn't have a security password policy, and then all of a sudden they enabled the password policy in 2003 SP1. Very similar to that here, okay? Now, the security defaults require all users to register for MFA, okay? All admins to use MFA, and requires the use of MFA when necessary. Remember, Microsoft is choosing when the user is going to see the MFA requirement. You don't have control over that. You do when you use conditional access policies, but not with the security default policy, okay? It also protects privileged activities, like gaining access to the interfaces and the tools and stuff like that. And what I consider to be also awesomely powerful, I just gave a presentation of this in Munich last week, which is blocking legacy authentication protocols, right? Obviously, when we start talking about NTLM, Kerberos, we really need to be careful about what we're throwing out on the internet and what's going through Intra ID. So this is very important. I actually, like I said, gave a full presentation on kind of how to secure your on-prem authentication protocols, as well as your protocols inside of Intra ID. It's totally different world from when you go from on-prem into the cloud, and what protocols are available and how you secure them. So if you would like more information about that, ping me, and I'd be more than happy to send you some information on that, because it is kind of an abyss of confusion, kind of like this whole security thing is around Microsoft 365. All right. As I mentioned, Microsoft is the one that determines if MFA is necessary, right? And it will prompt the user to use MFA. According to Microsoft, it's factors such as their location, the device, the role that the user has in the task that they're performing, which obviously kind of coincides with conditional access policies, right? And this is Microsoft's way of controlling what they see in the back end and actually increasing or decreasing when a user has to use MFA. We all know that MFA fatigue is real. And what we don't want to do is punish users constantly, because they're just going to complain and they're going to find workarounds. They're going to do things that we don't want them to do. So we definitely want to kind of keep in track when MFA is prompted for them. And this is Microsoft's way of doing that with the security defaults. Now, I did mention that these security default policy controls privileged access. And here is a kind of short list of what that is, right? The Azure portal, the Administrative Center, Azure PowerShell, and Azure Clyde. So it's kind of baked in, right? You configure it. Hey, this is fantastic. It gives me all these capabilities. And now I either don't have conditional access policies because I don't have the right level, or I don't really want to go in and configure those, okay? Which is also, in my opinion, a pretty important factor here in what we're going to talk about real soon, okay? So as I mentioned, blocking authentication protocols. So here you see that list of kind of legacy authentication protocols that the security default policy kind of blocks and says, sorry, these are not allowed. But here's where I really want to kind of throw up a warning, because you need to be aware of what is engaged at each level, okay? Now, to kind of finalize this authentication protocol configuration before we get into my big warning, which is all tied together with this, is any client using older mail protocols such as IMAP and POP3, those are going to be blocked, right? Those are absolutely going to be blocked. And then what you can do is you can actually go in and do application monitoring, which Microsoft recommends before you go in and start blocking everything. You make sure you know what's in place, okay? So you can go in here, are the steps for you to go in and do application monitoring, and right here you'll see the last bullet, or the next to last bullet there says select all legacy authentication protocols. So this is where you can kind of see the sign-in logs and what different applications are using. So Microsoft is not recommending you go in and just block things, because the phone is going to ring. We've all been around long enough to know that when we start blocking too much, things are going to break, and we certainly don't want that. So definitely use the sign-in logs. I would like to tell you that there is an easier way, but with conditional access policies, with blocking of policies or protocols, Microsoft is saying use the logs, right? For me, this is not the most efficient way of doing that. But again, you can send the logs into your SOC, and then you can have different rules on them to float them to the top. But if you're using the Microsoft technologies kind of out of the box, you have definite limitations on what you're going to be able to track down. Okay, here's my big warning with this, okay? You can either have security defaults or conditional access policies. Why is that so important? Well, as I've gone over in detail, security default policy gives you a lot out of the box. You have 0 conditional access policies by default, so you have to create them. Now, Microsoft has done a pretty good job of creating templatized conditional access policies so that you now they're kind of guided in what to configure. But if you're not aware of that, you could really create a big problem, okay? So just think for a minute. Okay, I've been relying on these security default policies for a while, and now I'm going to go in. I'm just going to. I don't want to use the word play around, but I'm going to go in and say I'm going to configure a conditional access policy. That immediately negates all of the security defaults. So that security default policy immediately is eliminated, and the only thing you have in place is your conditional access policy, which may not do much, right? You actually have to create the conditional access policy infrastructure to meet and exceed that of the default policy. And as soon as you create the one conditional access policy, the other settings go away. It disables the default policy. So be very careful here if you are relying on the default policy and then configure one conditional access policy. It negates everything that I just went over with all those other settings. So you kind of have to make sure that you're ready to configure all of your conditional access policies once you eliminate using the security default policy, okay? So that's what I wanted to go over at this point. And you can see, especially at first, we kind of had a jump back and forth between Microsoft 365 and Intra and Azure. Some things are here, some things are there. Not everything is as it appears, especially with MFA, right? There's 4 different places to go and configure MFA. And there's no real way of knowing the overlap, right? I come from a group policy background, and we at least had resultant set of policy. Well, we really don't have a resultant set of policy here. And when you ask Microsoft, they'll tell you, well, go look at the log and see what the log says. Right, well, I have 25,000 users, and you want me to try to track down what all my users are using if it's correct in that way? It's definitely a little bit difficult with that. So keep your eye on that, and hopefully this has been beneficial. And David, I'm going to send it back to you and see if we have any questions.
We sure do. Great job, Derek. And I'd like to remind the audience that we can take questions up until about 5 minutes to the top of the hour in order to give you a short break before the next session. So please send them on in now. And we do have a lot in there if you want to follow along, Derek, in the Q&A console. So let's get right to them and get to as many as we can. First one comes from Keefe. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Looks like he works for a credit union in Hawaii. He wants some hands-on advice. He says, for MFA and CAP, we are rolling out now and using legacy. We plan to enable CAP after we get everyone on board because we cannot go big bang. Is that okay?
Well, certainly you just used the word big bang, and I completely agree, right? And we all have to consider, right? And I will kind of tailor back my warning, right? There's no way to go from the default policy to a full-blown conditional access policy, right? You're going to have time for that. It may take your weekend, it may take some testing, but it's not like a switch, right? Which is kind of a pain. I really wish it was a switch, but it's difficult to kind of push it out all at once. Plus, you don't want the big bang, right? You don't want to implement something across the board that your help desk is not going to be able to support. So you definitely want this to be rolling out, and I think you're absolutely correct in some of your terminology here, and you want to roll things out, make sure that your basics are in place for security-wise, and then add as you go through, right? Add as you go through, especially we want to secure our administrative accounts at all priority, right? I mean, I think most of us agree that our non-administrative accounts can I don't want to say this, but I'm going to, most likely can be compromised pretty easily, but we don't care as much because, well, they don't have the privileges. And so, on-prem AD, Azure AD, we're not nearly as concerned about normal user accounts as we are administrative accounts.
Okay, great. Next question comes from Craig in the audience. A very simple one. Why do you think that on-premises AD isn't going away?
I mean, two reasons, right? One, there are too many legacy applications and services that require on-prem AD. Two, the proof of that is I literally asked the question in front of every audience, who has eliminated their on-prem AD? And at this point in the year 2023, it's way less than 5%. I'm going to say it's about 2%. And not only is it 2%, it's a very small vertical, right? Universities, maybe, educational, maybe, smaller companies, absolutely. But if I'm a startup, well, I'll just tell everybody, if you're a startup, I certainly wouldn't suggest you use on-prem AD. I would suggest you go a totally different route. But those organizations that have on-prem AD, very difficult to get rid of it. So that's kind of my take on that.
Okay, great. Next question comes from Mark in the audience. He says, if you register new users in on-prem and Azure Connect creates the user in AAD, which policy source should rule?
Well, it depends on, I'm assuming you mean password policy source. And the password policy source, again, goes back to that diagram and exactly what is configured to control. You can actually have controls to push in a hybrid environment your users to use a little bit of both even. So I can use the on-prem AD password policy controls around, again, GPOs and PSOs, but I can also engage the password list, right, the banned list. So there are options for combining them, and it takes the whole issue, right? I've been dealing with password policies for 23 years or more. It does take the complexity of password policies to a whole new level, which is why you have to test, and which is why I'm going to say that you need to test when you put something in place. But depending on how you have the configurations is what you're going to get. Now, any of these questions, if I don't answer them to your liking or you would like more information, please send me an email, shoot me the question. I'd love to show you my interface or take screen captures and kind of point you down the path of where you can go and configure these things. It's just I can't share my screen in this particular format. So if I don't answer it to your liking, please just send me an email and I'd be more than happy to go over it with you.
Very generous. And actually, Eric from the audience weighed in. He doesn't have a question, but he comments on that. He says, I will just add, ours is dying, talking about on-prem AD. We are actively eliminating it, should be gone in 3 years. So let's get to the next question. Yeah, that's the way down the road.
Hey, you know what? Ping me in 3 years and let me know if you were successful. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean that in a totally, let me know if you were successful, because it's funny you say we're trying to get rid of it in 3 years from now. 3 years from now, who knows where we'll be?
Exactly. Okay, next question comes from Max in the audience. Simple question. Where do we find smart lockout setting?
So the smart lockout setting is right above the banned list, right? So when you configure your banned list, you have the ability to have the smart lockout, right? So the smart lockout is the threshold and the duration in seconds. And that's kind of what Microsoft puts in the background there, right? So it's in password protection. I'm looking at it right here on my screen. Custom smart lockout. It's under password protection. And again, email me and I'm more happy to I can send you a screen capture of both Intra and Azure so you can kind of see where both of those are.
Okay, great. Next question. We have a lot of them. Let's try and get through these. From Aaron in the audience, how does the password and other policies set up in Entra ID/Azure AD work for remote users? Does it take a connection to a VPN for those to work?
Certainly, because if I don't have connectivity through a VPN, I'm using local, right? I'm using my cache information. So you have to have some connectivity, whether it be into the cloud, if you're using the cloud environment, or you have connectivity, however you're going to get there, to your on-prem environment to use that password policy. But yeah, you need that communication in order to have those things engage, right? Especially if you're going to try to reset the password, or if you have a password policy that you are connected to the VPN and the password policy is telling you that you're not meeting the password policy and resetting your password.
Okay. Craig from the audience, who had an earlier question, has another one about on-prem AD. Very simple. Do you recommend moving from on-prem AD to Entra ID?
Oh, what a great question. Thanks, Craig. That is a great question. And here's my answer to that. It's not apples and apples. It's not even apples and oranges, right? You're talking cabbage and apples. Entra ID is an identity and access management platform. On-prem AD is a network operating system. Completely different, right? Entra ID does not have organizational units. Doesn't even have domain controllers, right? Yes, Intune has really come a long way, and I'm kind of shocked that I'm even saying that, because Intune used to be really something I would push people away from. But look at Intune, right? And now they're creating group policy to Intune migration paths. But it's not either or, because Entra ID does not provide even close to what on-prem AD provides. You have to have a multitude of services around Entra ID to come close to what you have for on-prem AD, which is why, again, I'll go back to, we're not going to get rid of on-prem AD anytime soon. You have to have other things in place to control the environment like on-prem AD does.
Okay, looks like we have time for one more question. It comes from Matt in the audience. Is there anything that can actually be done about password spray attacks? We are using conditional access, but that only takes effect after login, so the logs are full with password spray attacks constantly.
Yep, there's nothing you can do. There's nothing you can do to stop one from starting. You want to detect it as soon as possible, right? I mean, when you look at the RockU list of passwords, when you look at some of the other things that are out on the internet and the analysis that's occurred, the attackers know what they're doing. And so what we need to do is we need to detect password spray attacks as soon as possible and shut them down as soon as possible so they're not successful. But there's nothing you can do to eliminate them from starting. And I wish I had a different answer, but there's not.
Yeah, that kind of surprised me. There's nothing you can do. But there are some remediation.
Think about it this way. Is there any way to stop someone from going around a parking lot and trying to open every door of a car?
Yeah, good analogy. Yeah, sure.
I mean, I can't stop them from it, but if I have video surveillance or if I have something in place, now I can shut them down. But anyone can go around a parking garage or a parking lot and just try to open up doors. Kind of the same type of thing with a password spray.
Okay, well, it looks like that's all the questions we have time for. So thanks again, Derek, for an excellent presentation and answering all those questions.
Thank you so much, and I want to thank all the attendees and the sponsors, and and of course, Redmond, and it's been my pleasure.
Thank you for being here. Thank you to our speakers, my fellow moderators, and of course, our sponsors, Commvault, Mimecast, Cohesity, Druva, and Barracuda, for underwriting this summit and allowing us to bring you this great content. My name is Chris Paley, editor, and I am here to moderate the second session of our Microsoft 365 Security Summit, called Top 10 Microsoft 365 Security Best Practices Every Organization Must Implement. Our speaker for this session is Brian Posey, Microsoft MVP. Brian Posey is a freelance technology author and a 22-time Microsoft MVP. Throughout his career, Brian has written or contributed to dozens of IT books, created numerous full-length video training courses, and has published thousands of blog posts on a huge variety of IT and space-related topics. Many of these blog posts can be found in his Posey's Tips and Tricks column on redmondmag.com. Take it away, Brian.
Hey, thank you so much, Chris. Hello, greetings, and welcome, everyone. So today we're going to be talking all about various best practices for keeping your Microsoft 365 environment secure. So when I was putting this presentation together, I stopped and thought about it, and I can think of loads of things that would be considered security best practices for Microsoft 365. But I had the idea that I wonder if Microsoft has already created a top 10 list. So I did a Google search, and lo and behold, yes, they did. They created a list of the top 10 things that you should be doing to keep your environment secure. So my idea was to go with that. But as I started really digging into the list, I began to realize that this list probably wasn't as good as it could be. Here's the list right here. This came directly from Microsoft. If you want to check this out for yourself, there's a URL at the bottom of the page. So in my opinion, half of the items on this list are absolutely relevant. The other half almost seem like commercials for Microsoft 365, which seems weird considering that anybody who's reading the article that this came from probably already has Microsoft 365. So what I want to do is briefly run through the items on this list, and then there's several of these that I'm going to go into in quite a bit more depth because, as I said, I do find them to be particularly relevant. From there, once I get done with that, I've got some best practices of my own that I want to go ahead and talk about in lieu of some of the ones that really aren't all that relevant that are on the list that you see on your slide right now. Then once I get through with those, I want to take whatever time I've got left and delve into something brand new that's coming for Microsoft 365 called Security Copilot. If you haven't heard about this, it promises to be an absolute game changer for Microsoft 365. So I've got a ton of material to cover, but that's an overview of where I'm planning on going with this. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first item on the list is multi-factor authentication, and that really shouldn't be all that surprising because depending on which article you read from Microsoft, Microsoft estimates anywhere from 80% to 99% of account compromise attacks can be stopped through the use of multi-factor authentication. So it's no wonder that that's the very first thing on their list. Now, full disclosure, I'm not sure I necessarily agree with Microsoft's assessment of the percentages, but regardless of that, multi-factor authentication is definitely something that can benefit your organization's security. The next item on the list, protect admin accounts. Again, something absolutely crucial to do. Your admin accounts are high value, and any attacker who's going after your Microsoft 365 environment seeks to eventually gain access to those protected admin accounts. So it's important to do all that you can to make sure that those accounts are secure. Number 3, use preset security policies. I think that one's fairly self-explanatory. Number 4, protect all of your devices. Because one of the things to keep in mind with regard to Microsoft 365 security is that it's not just about securing the platform itself. It's also about securing anything that happens to connect to that platform. Because let's say that your user connects to Microsoft 365 using a device that's got a keylogger on it, and that keylogger is able to get the user's password, and they're not using multi-factor authentication, well, then that user's credentials have been leaked. So you've got to take device security seriously. What number are we on? Number 5, use email securely. So this means doing what you can to ensure that Exchange Online is secure, but at a bare minimum, I would suggest enabling features such as safe links and safe attachments. If you're not familiar with safe links, it's a mechanism that does URL rewriting. So let's say for a moment that a user receives an email and that email contains some links that may or may not be malicious. What Microsoft 365 Safe Links does is it takes a look at those links and it tests them. And if the link goes to a phishing site or a site containing malicious code, then the URL is rewritten. So that way, if the user clicks on that URL, then it will take them to a warning page rather than taking them to the malicious site. So by using that Safe Links feature, you can fend off a lot of phishing attacks. Safe Attachments is exactly what it sounds like. Microsoft intercepts attachments that are attached to inbound email messages, and it uses a technique that it calls detonation. Specifically, what this means is putting that attachment into a sandboxed environment and then opening the attachment up and just seeing what happens. Is the attachment going to try to do anything bad? So that's what Safe Attachments does. Assuming everything's safe, then that attachment gets re-added back into the email, and the user receives it, and they're none the wiser. Number 6, work together in Microsoft Teams. To be honest with you, I have absolutely no idea why this is on a list of security best practices, aside from the fact that maybe Microsoft considers Teams to be one of the safest places to work. I don't know. Number 7, set file sharing settings. I think this probably comes down to using least user access. In other words, users shouldn't have any access to any files that they don't absolutely need in order to do their jobs. Because if an attack were to occur, that attack can't infect anything that the user doesn't have permission to access. Number 8, use Microsoft 365 apps. Again, I've kind of got to make an assumption with this. My guess, and I'm only guessing, but my guess is that Microsoft considers the Office 365 apps to be safer than the web apps. And in a way that kind of makes sense, because if a user's browser is compromised, maybe they have a malicious plugin installed or something like that, and they attempt to access the web apps, then perhaps the data that's exposed through those web apps could be compromised as a result of that compromised browser. So it makes sense to use the Microsoft 365 apps. And then we have number 9, manage calendar sharing. Again, self-explanatory. And number 10, maintain your environment. And this goes back to the idea of what I was talking about earlier, that anything that is accessing Microsoft 365 needs to be kept secure. So you want to make sure that you're installing security updates and doing whatever other maintenance needs to be done in your environment. So that's Microsoft's top 10 list. Now, before I really start delving into the individual items, one thing that I want to be sure and talk about is that Microsoft has something called the shared responsibility model. I'm sure you've probably heard of it. At its simplest, a shared responsibility model is something that nearly all cloud providers have, and it states what the cloud provider is responsible for versus what the customer is responsible for. In the case of Microsoft 365, it really boils down to Microsoft is responsible for the platform, the customer is responsible for the data. So Microsoft keeps the platform running, and they keep the underlying infrastructure secure. But the customers are responsible for backing up their own data and for keeping that data secure. Now, having said that, Microsoft also has something, and I'm not sure if they still do this because Microsoft's marketing department changes the names of things around from time to time. But for a while, they had something called Secure by Default. It was an initiative that had come out of Redmond. And Secure by Default has a really long heritage. It can trace its roots back to the days of Windows XP and Vista. The idea was that back in the day of Windows XP and Vista, Windows desktops were super insecure. Infections were rampant. There were all kinds of security problems. And Microsoft began to get a reputation as providing very insecure operating systems. So in response, Microsoft said, okay, well, we've got all of these security features that are baked into the operating system. Why not turn them on by default and make Windows secure? It seems like a really obvious thing to do, but that was brand new at the time. Keep in mind, we're talking about many years ago. But the idea behind Secure by Default was, let's just make Windows as secure as we possibly can at the time of installation. And the concept of Secure by Default was eventually extended to other Microsoft products. The problem is that Secure by Default flies in direct opposition to the shared responsibility model, because the shared responsibility model essentially states you're responsible for securing your own data, whereas Secure by Default states that your data is already secure. So which is it? Well, I think the truth lies somewhere in between. Microsoft does enable certain security features by default, but not all of them. And they do provide some level of security. But secure by default by itself has a couple of problems associated with it. First, it can give admins a false sense of security. Second, it opens the question of how much security do you really need versus how much security is enabled. I mean, what does it mean to be secure by default? Does it mean that whatever product it is has been secured to the greatest extent possible? Or does it mean that you have just enough security to get by on and nothing more? Or somewhere in between? Security has to be balanced against usability, and not all organizations have the same security needs. Just to give you an example, no joke, earlier in my career, I worked at Fort Knox. And as I'm sure you can imagine, Fort Knox took security very, very seriously. But because of that, usability was kind of a pain. You had to jump through a lot of hoops to do pretty much anything just because of all of the security that was in place. Unfortunately, I'm not allowed to talk about that security. I wish I could. But the point being that Fort Knox was very, very secure, but it wasn't very usable. And I'm guessing that most end users don't want Fort Knox level security on the stuff that they use every single day, because it would really, really slow them down, and it would cause simple things like using their computer to become far more cumbersome than what they're used to. So while the idea of make it as secure as possible sounds really good, it's a case of be careful what you wish for. There's a certain thing as the proper amount of security, and that's going to be different for every organization. You have to decide what's right for your own environment. So the big takeaway from that is that not every security feature is enabled by default, even though many are. So why might Microsoft not enable a security feature by default? Well, there are any number of reasons. One is that it might overlap with another security feature. I'll be showing you an example of that later on. Another is that it might get in the way of usability, as I talked about with my Fort Knox example. Another possible reason is that maybe the feature is included with every licensing plan and Microsoft wants to give its customers a consistent experience, so they choose not to enable that particular feature by default. I don't know for sure that they do that, but it seems plausible. And then the fourth reason on the list is that it isn't something that can be automatically enabled. Maybe there's some setting that is unique to your environment that has to be secured, so automatically enabling, some setting that's unique to your environment that has to be manually configured, so it's impossible to automatically enable that particular feature. So all of that is to say that Microsoft gives you various security tools to choose from, but it's up to you to pick and choose which tools are right for your own organization. So as I mentioned earlier, it's not just Microsoft 365 that has to be kept secure, but it's anything that's connected to Microsoft 365. And that's one of the big things that often gets missed. You know, end users are notorious for falling for phishing attacks. That's one of the big things that's often talked about in IT. But phishing attacks are really only one way that an external threat can harm your Microsoft 365 data. As I mentioned earlier, compromised devices are also an issue. So it's really important to consider your on-premises environment and how those devices are configured. If you're using Azure AD Connect, you need to think about the health of your internal Active Directory because it's being replicated up to the Microsoft 365 cloud. And of course, any BYOD devices. So with that said, Microsoft doesn't provide a comprehensive checklist of all the security features and which ones it recommends enabling versus not enabling, because that list would be insanely long. It would be different for every organization. There would be a different list for every subscription plan. But there really are some good independent checklists online, and it doesn't take all that much searching to find one. So I would encourage you to go out and take a look at some of those. So as I started to think about who might provide a decent checklist, one of the first names that came to mind was CISA. And CISA does indeed provide a checklist for securing Microsoft 365. Now, a couple of things that I want to mention about the CISA checklist. One, it's kind of basic, and two, it's a couple of years old. Even so, I think that it's a really good starting point for keeping your Microsoft 365 environment secure. Because for one thing, the CISA checklist is no nonsense. It gets down to what's important, and it focuses on that. And two, it ties directly back to Microsoft's top 10 list. So there's a degree of consistency there between what Microsoft recommends and what CISA recommends. So let's go ahead and take a look at CISA's recommendations. So the very first recommendation is enable multi-factor authentication for administrator accounts. Now, as you'll recall, Microsoft's checklist had enabling multi-factor authentication as the very first item on the list. Now, CISA differentiates between enabling MFA for administrators versus enabling it for end users. The idea being that if you're an administrator, you're doing important things, and so you need a bit more scrutiny over that login process. So administrators should ideally receive an MFA challenge every single time that they log in to do something, because you want them proving their identity over and over. You don't want to trust anything. And it goes right along with those zero trust principles that we so often hear about. Users, on the other hand, probably don't need quite that amount of scrutiny, although there are certainly exceptions. Certainly going back to my Fort Knox example, that place would have been an exception. But within users, you have to worry about things like MFA fatigue, because there are ways of circumventing multi-factor authentication. So the idea within users, make it so that they have to register for multi-factor authentication, but you're not nagging them every single time that they log in to complete an MFA challenge. You only want to do that when something is different or something really stands out as a threat. Maybe a user is logging on from a different location or a different device or something like that. So how do you enable multi-factor authentication? Well, it's really easy to do. As you can see, I'm in the Microsoft Entra Admin Center. And if you look at the red arrow on the screen, you can see that Azure AD is now Microsoft Entra ID. I still can't get used to that. I'm not sure why Microsoft changed the name, but you'll probably hear me referring to it as Azure Active Directory or Azure AD. At any rate, the first step is to go to the Properties tab, which you can see with the blue arrow. And then from there, there is a link down at the bottom of the page, Manage Security Defaults. So click on that link, and you're taken to the Security Defaults page. And as you can see right now, security defaults are disabled, which is not recommended, and you just use the drop-down list to enable it. That's all you have to do. It's that simple. Now, before I get into what the security defaults are really doing and what this has to do with multi-factor authentication, there are a couple of things that I need to mention. If you're deploying a new Microsoft 365 environment, security defaults are going to be enabled by default. So you don't even have to worry about turning on multi-factor authentication. It's already going to be on. Now, if you've got an older Microsoft 365 implementation, Microsoft is in the process and has been for several months now of going through and turning that on for their customers, whether they want it or not. So that screen that I just showed you where you can turn it on, Microsoft will turn that on for you, but you can use that screen to turn it back off if you want. So typically what you're going to find, if you haven't already had it turned on you, is that one day you'll log in and you'll get a pop-up saying security defaults are enabled, but oh, by the way, here's a snooze button you can click, and that will delay it by 2 weeks. And then if you want to permanently disable it, use the method that I just showed you. So what are the security defaults, and what are they doing? Well, there's 4 things that the security defaults will do for you. First of all, it requires all users and all admins to register for multi-factor authentication. That's the big one. Second, it makes sure that users aren't being nagged constantly by multi-factor authentication challenges. Users will primarily receive those prompts when they log in with a new device or a new app, or they're performing some really critical task. Another thing that it does is it disables authentication from legacy authentication clients that can't do MFA. So if a user is trying to log in with a really old version of Outlook, for example, well, Outlook doesn't, or that version of Outlook doesn't support modern authentication, so it's no longer allowed to be used. And then it's also going to disable those legacy authentication clients, and it protects admins by requiring a multi-factor authentication challenge every time that they log in. So that's what the security defaults do. So as I mentioned earlier, you can opt out of that using the method that I showed you. But why opt out? Well, there are a couple of reasons. One is that maybe turning off legacy authentication is going to break something. Maybe you have a really old application that depends on that, and if you shut down legacy authentication, that application is not going to work. That might be a viable reason for disabling security defaults, although there are workarounds where you can disable or enable security defaults for everybody else but leave it disabled for that. Another potential problem is that you've got some application that uses a service account that doesn't support multi-factor authentication. That might be another reason for opting out. But the big one that Microsoft talks about is that you shouldn't be using security defaults if you have access to conditional access policies, because conditional access policies give you a greater degree of control over the environment than security defaults do. So let's take a look at that. Now, conditional access policies aren't available in every Microsoft 365 plan. If you want to use conditional access policies, you're going to need Azure Active Directory Premium P1 or P2. Told you I would refer to Intra as Azure Active Directory. It's also included with Microsoft 365 Business Premium, E3 or E5, and Enterprise Mobility and Security E3 or E5. So, conditional access policies are essentially security-related if-then statements. So when you build a conditional access policy, you create a condition that's essentially your if, and you create a control that's like your then statement. So what you see on the screen right now is a screen capture from the welcome screen that appears when you go into conditional access policies. And it gives a couple of examples, and this was taken directly within Microsoft 365. So for each one, you see a condition, which is like your if statement, and a control, which is like a then statement. So the first one, the condition, when any user is outside the company network, the control, they're required to sign in with multi-factor authentication. And that could almost be read as if a user is outside the company network, then they're required to sign in with multi-factor authentication. And then the next example is if when a user in the managers group signs in, then they're required to be on an Intune compliant or domain joined device. And those are just a couple of examples of how you can use conditional access policies. So let's go back to what we were talking about earlier with the security defaults. The way that you would handle that with conditional access policies is to go into the Microsoft Intra Admin Center, which remember was Azure AD, click on Protection, then select the Conditional Access tab, and then click on Create a New Policy. That's going to take you to the screen right here, and you'll notice that the very first option is require multi-factor authentication for admins. So there's a template that you can use to create that conditional access policy. You don't even have to do it from scratch. It's really easy to do. So let's get back to that list from CISA. The second item on the list is assign administrator roles using role-based access control, or RBAC. And this goes right along with one of the items that was on Microsoft's checklist about protecting administrative accounts. The basic idea behind this is really simple. As I talked about earlier, admin accounts are high-value targets for attackers. You never, ever, ever want an admin account to be compromised. So one of the best things that you can do to keep that from happening is to assign administrators only the roles that they need to perform their job. So that way, if an account is compromised, you're not giving the attacker the keys to the kingdom. You're only allowing them to access some segment of the organization, which is bad enough, obviously, but at least they don't have full control over everything. Now, in addition to using role-based access control, there are a couple of other suggestions that I would make. First of all, create at least 2 global administrator accounts, which I know kind of contradicts the statement, but go ahead and create 2 global administrator accounts and treat those as break glass accounts. So what that means is that you'll assign those accounts a super strong password, and then you'll lock it away in a vault or someplace secure, never ever to be seen again, unless you have a dire emergency that can't be fixed in any other way, in which case you would retrieve those accounts from the vault and use it to log in and fix the problem. Another thing that I would recommend is giving administrators a dedicated workstation, and if not physical, a virtual machine within their primary workstation, so that administrative activities are only performed from an operating system that's been very well maintained and hardened to the greatest degree possible. And that will help to reduce the chances of that account becoming compromised. Also, administrators should only should only use an administrative account for performing administrative duties. They should be using standard user accounts for things like checking their email or interacting with SharePoint or having a Teams meeting or anything like that. So separate administrative duties from routine job responsibilities. That will go a long way toward protecting that administrative account. But let's get back to the issue of role-based access control. Microsoft makes it super easy to use role-based access control. As you can see, I'm in the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, and if you expand the roles container, there's another container called Role Assignments, and it lists a whole bunch of roles. And there's a lot more. This is just what would fit on the slide. So you open up the role, and then you add that user to it, and then that user receives that administrative delegation. So the next item on the CISA list is enable unified audit log. Now, this one's a really tricky one. Essentially, Microsoft 365, like any other modern operating system or application, is able to do event logging. And what CISA is recommending is to go ahead and enable that event logging. Now, I said that this was a tricky one, and the reason for that is that if you go out to the Microsoft documentation, which I've provided a link to that at the bottom of the slide, Microsoft states that audit logging is turned on by default for Microsoft 365 organizations, but that they recommend going ahead and verifying that it is indeed enabled. So the reason why I say this is tricky is because here Microsoft is telling you, hey, audit logging is enabled by default. And yet my experience has been the exact opposite. In fact, I've got a Microsoft 365 account that is less than 2 months old, and audit logging was not enabled by default on that account. So my recommendation would be to not assume that audit logging is enabled, but actually take the steps to go out and look at audit logging and just make sure that it is indeed turned on. So let me show you how to do that. What you do is open up Microsoft Purview, and that's the old Compliance Admin Center, and then go to Policies, and then select the Solutions tab, and then click Audit. And then that's going to take you to the screen right here. As you can see, you've got various fields that you can use to search the audit logs, but right now those are all grayed out. Now, if you look next to the red arrow, there's a banner that says Start Recording User and Admin Activity. That's an indication that the audit logging is turned off. So to turn that on, you would click on this banner. So the next CISA recommendation is enable multi-factor authentication for all users. We already talked about that with regard to the security defaults and the conditional access policies. They also recommend disable legacy protocol authentication when appropriate. And I touched on this earlier with regard to the security defaults, but just to clarify, the legacy protocol authentication, that refers to really, really old protocols. I'm talking about things that have existed for as long as the internet, and they were once staples of the way that people worked, but today they're completely insecure and outdated. I'm talking about messaging protocols, things like POP3 and Simple Message Transfer Protocol, or SMTP, things like that. So if you enable the security defaults, then those legacy protocols are going to be disabled automatically, but you can also do this with conditional access policies. So the way that you would do that is to go back to that template screen that I showed you earlier, but if you look about halfway down the screen, you'll see a series of horizontal tabs. When I showed you the screen earlier, we were looking at the Secure Foundation tab, but if you look at the screen, you can see that I've selected Protect Administrator. And we have a couple of options here. The first one, require multi-factor authentication for admins. And then just to the right of that, we have block legacy authentication. So you would use that block legacy authentication option to fulfill this recommendation. So the next thing that we have is enable alerts for suspicious activity. And this, again, is easy to do, but it requires logging. So the basic idea is that something nefarious happens, it gets written to your audit logs, and then an alerting mechanism makes you aware of it. So the way that you would go in and enable this is to open up Microsoft Purview. Again, that's the old Compliance Admin Center. And you'll notice that we have a red arrow pointing to alerts. You don't go there. The alerts is for viewing alerts. Instead, you go to Policies and then click on Alert Policies. And then that's going to take you to the screen right here. And there are a number of alert policies that are created by default. For example, suspicious email sending patterns detected, email messages removed after delivery, email messages from a campaign removed after delivery, admin triggered user compromise investigation, a user clicked through to a potentially malicious URL, suspicious connector activity, and the list goes on and on and on. There's a lot more than these. And if you look in the upper left corner of the slide, there's also a link that you can click to create a new alert policy. So you can choose to be alerted to custom things. And then the next thing on the CISA list is incorporate Microsoft Secure Score. I'm not going to go into this one too in depth in the interest of time, but Secure Score is a tool that Microsoft gives you. It's in the Defender portal under secure.microsoft.com, and you can see it right here. Essentially, it's a numerical score that represents how secure or insecure Microsoft perceives your Microsoft 365 environment to be. And they provide this list of recommended actions that you can follow to improve your score. And so for each one of these actions, there's a value associated with it, and your score will increase by that much if you perform that action. Now, there are a couple of things that you need to know about Secure Score. One, not every security recommendation is appropriate for every organization. So there may be things that Microsoft recommends that just really don't work well for your organization. Maybe it disrupts your business processes, and maybe it's going to cause something to break. So just because something's listed here doesn't necessarily mean that it's in your best interest to do it. Another thing with regard to Secure Score is that CISA points out, sorry, I lost my place for a second. CISA points out that Secure Score is not all-encompassing. So there may be things that you should do from a security standpoint that aren't listed in Secure Score. Secure Score is a good starting point, but it's not the be-all, end-all. In other words, if you do everything Secure Score recommends, are you going to be more secure than most? Absolutely. But are you going to be invulnerable? Probably not. And then one last thing that I'll mention about Secure Score before I move on is that Microsoft also provides something called the Identity Secure Score. It's in the Intra-Admin Center. And it provides a screen similar to this, but related to your Azure Active Directory identities. And the reason why I mention that is there's a lot of overlap between the two, but it gives you a little bit more information. For example, it tells you what the impact on the end users is going to be if you were to enable a particular recommendation. So there are some things you can do from a security standpoint that the end users will never notice. There are other things that you might do that have a drastic impact on the end users. And whether or not you choose to do that, it's good to at least know how it's going to affect the users before you take action. Then CISA recommends integrate logs with your existing SIEM tool. So all that logging that you implemented, well, if you've got a system information and event manager tool that you're already using from a third party, see if it can be extended to incorporate those logs from Microsoft 365 so that way you're not creating management silos. You've got all of your logging data in one place, and you can cross-reference those logs. So a summary of the CISA recommendations, encourage organizations to implement an organizational cloud strategy to protect their infrastructure assets, use multi-factor authentication, protect the admin accounts, implement alerting, use a SIEM solution if you've got one, and disable legacy protocols. So those are the CISA recommendations. I've also got a couple of recommendations of my own before I move on to the Security Copilot. One is to implement self-service password reset capabilities. Now, in some ways, this would seem counterproductive from a security standpoint because it seems like something that an attacker would be able to use to gain access to a user's account. Simply reset a password, use the new password to log in as that user. The thing about it is that the self-service password reset interface takes several steps to prove the user's identity before it will allow them to reset their password. And you can actually improve security by giving users self-service password reset capabilities because you're taking the help desk out of the equation. So you never have to worry about one of those situations where the help desk asks the user their security question, and now whoever's working the help desk suddenly knows the answer to the user's question because the user just told them. So you can improve your security by enabling self-service password reset. And the way that you do that is by going into the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, clicking on Org Settings, and then that's going to take you to this screen right here. This screen, I believe it used to allow you to do it directly. Now there's a link to go to the Azure portal and turn on self-service password reset. So click that link, you come to this screen right here, and then you choose if you want to enable self-service password reset for all of your users, selected users, or nobody at all. Now, one last bit of advice before I start getting into Security Copilot is that if you don't already have a Microsoft 365 E5 subscription, take a serious look at that. Now, I'm not trying to hustle Microsoft 365 subscriptions. I'm not getting any kind of kickback from Microsoft. There's nothing like that going on. The reason why I say this is because there are huge, huge differences in the security features that you get in a Microsoft 365 E5 account versus most of the other accounts. And if you're not familiar with all those differences, then there's a way that you can get a free subscription for lab use. I've linked to an article that I wrote, And if you go out to that article, it will walk you through the process of setting up a free E5 account. Now, that account has some limitations associated with it. It's only licensed for lab use. You can't associate a custom domain name with the account. And the account will expire after a couple of months and go away. But having said that, aside from those things, it's a fully functional E5 account with a 25 user license count. So you can use that account to set up an environment that mimics your production environment and see what security features exist as compared with whatever you're using right now, and try those security features out, see how they work for you. And if it's worth your time and your investment to upgrade to E5, or if you're totally satisfied with what you've got. So with that said, let's move on and use the last little bit of time that we've got to talk about Security Copilot. Security Copilot, if you've heard about this, it's a large language model bolted onto a security analytics tool. So what that means is that you can use natural language queries to find out things about your organization's security. Now, so far, Microsoft hasn't given a release date for Security Copilot. The most recent thing that I have heard about this is that Microsoft is doing private invitation-only testing, and that they've expanded the size of the testing group, and they're testing over the course of the fall. But they haven't indicated when this is actually going to be released. But it's certainly something worth keeping your eye on. Also, Microsoft hasn't given any pricing details that I've seen. But it's a pretty safe bet that this is going to be an add-on subscription as opposed to a feature that's included with your normal Microsoft 365 subscription. And there are a couple of reasons why I say that. One, Microsoft has something called Microsoft 365 Copilot that's going to be coming out really soon. And that's different from Security Copilot. Microsoft 365 Copilot is geared more toward content creation. And that's an add-on subscription. If anybody's curious, I think the price was $30 per user per month on top of the Microsoft 365 subscription fee. So it's not cheap, and we'll probably see something similar for Security Copilot. Another reason why I think it's probably going to be an extra fee is simply because that seems to be the way that the industry is going. There are quite a few different companies that are providing generative AI tools at the moment, and almost all of them are either charging a subscription fee or requiring their customers to purchase credits that can be used for generative AI. So it's a pretty safe bet that this is going to be a paid add-on. Having said that, Security Copilot has the potential to be an absolute game changer for security. But it isn't perfect. It has at least one major shortcoming, and I'm going to show you that shortcoming at the very end of this presentation. So as I mentioned, Security Copilot involves an interface where you type security questions. Incidentally, you can also drag and drop files to the box that you see on the screen. And I'm sorry if these screen captures are a little fuzzy. These actually came from a YouTube video. And there's a link to a blog article where Microsoft has the video embedded. So if you want to see the Copilot demo for yourself, you can go to that link and see it. But some of the questions that were proposed for use with Copilot are things like, what are some trending threats? How can I improve my security posture? Which alerts are being triggered the most? And tell me about my latest incidents. Now, as I mentioned, you can drag and drop files into Security Copilot. So here we have somebody dragging a log file from a Windows workstation and then asking, does this log file have malicious activity associated, does this log file have malicious activity related to Microsoft Sentinel suspicious login activity detection? So they're referencing a specific vulnerability and then asking Security Copilot if there's anything in that log file that would point to that vulnerability being exploited. Now, this raises a lot of question about privacy, and Microsoft has issued a statement saying that any security prompts and responses are stored within the tenant and are kept private. To put it in another way, they said your data is your data. So any queries that you make and the responses that you receive are written to immutable storage. So that way you've got a log of all of the Security Copilot activity. You can see what it produced, what was asked, and how it's being used. So as you use Security Copilot, it's going to produce typically quite a bit of information. Some of that information is going to be more useful than others. But if you find something that is really useful that other members of the security team need to know about, you can pin that information to a pin board, and that information is automatically going to be summarized, as you can see here. And you have the ability to use collaborative tools to share that information with other people on your team. Now, the absolute coolest thing about Security Copilot, at least in my opinion, is that it's extensible through the use of something called prompt books. Now, a prompt book is a mechanism that's supplied by Microsoft. They've hinted that this is not something that third-party developers are going to be able to create. It's going to have to come from Microsoft. But it extends the capabilities of Copilot so that Copilot can do things that it wouldn't otherwise be capable of. So as I mentioned, Copilot is essentially just a security analytics tool with a large language interface bolted onto it. So a runbook will allow it to do things that security analytics functionality wouldn't normally be able to. So in their demo, Microsoft showed off a prompt book that allowed them to reverse engineer a malicious script. And they actually reverse engineered more than just the script. They showed the full attack that was done using that script. So let me show you what that looks like. So Microsoft drugged the script to Security Copilot, and Security Copilot produced a ton of information based on that script. And this is a little bit hard to read because, as I mentioned, this came off of a YouTube video. So what I did is I transcribed it on the right. It's not a 100% perfect transcription. I took a couple of liberties just for the sake of saving space on the slide, but it's a faithful reproduction of what the slide was getting at. I haven't put anything down that changes the meaning. Essentially, it comes out and says the query returned one result and shows the content of a PowerShell script that was executed on the machine workstation on February 26, 2023, that downloaded a file named doorbreach.exe from a suspicious URL. And then it goes on to say that it created some Windows Defender exclusions to avoid detection, and it talked about where it was stored. And then it went on to explain that the URL appears to be a legitimate website, but with a malicious query string that contains a stage and a code parameter, and that it's likely that doorbreach.exe was executed in a hidden window and likely established a callback to the attacker. So that's pretty alarming, and yet Security Copilot got all of this just by analyzing that script. And then there's a bit more information on the screen. It goes on and it says, yes, we think you were compromised, and here's the reasons why. And then it points to the existence of a malicious PowerShell script, the existence of a malware executable. It points to the existence of a specific URL that was used that's known to be malicious. And then it goes on and talks about other reasons why they believe that this was indeed malicious and that you were attacked. So the next logical question might be, how in the world did this happen? Well, what you can actually do using that runbook, or that prompt book rather, is to produce a visual to explain the activity of the download and the exploit and how it moved through the entire incident. Now, again, I know the chart is hard to read, so I created a text version of it on the right side. So essentially what happened is that the script came from an unknown source, and then a user named Devon Torres, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, ran the script on a workstation named Workstation. They launched OneNote. They opened a OneNote package they called wscript.exe, that in turn called PowerShell, that invoked a PowerShell script called doorbreach.ps1, and then that downloaded the executable. And the executable connected to a C2 server. It opened up a PowerShell session and contacted a domain controller. So here we have the full anatomy of the attack shown in simple chart form. And all of that was done by just issuing a text-based query to Security Copilot. And Security Copilot also provided additional information to go along with that chart. There's an alert summary. I'm not going to read all of this in the interest of time. And there's also the attack steps. So we have step-by-step in text summary form a description of the attack. So a few observations about that. One, the diagram, the alert summary, and the attack steps were all generated from a single query. Essentially, somebody put in a query that said something like, what happened here? And every bit of that was produced from that one query. Number two, as it stands right now, it would be necessary to read all three of these, the chart, the alert summary, and the attack steps. Because even though there's a lot of overlap between the three, each one gives you slightly different information, and each one tells you something that the others didn't. So together they paint a comprehensive picture of what really happened. Point number 3, Security Copilot is a tool for assessing the situation, not for preventing the attack. So we're analyzing an attack that has already happened, but Security Copilot isn't doing anything to prevent that attack, because in this case, at least, the attack already happened. And then the last point on the slide, Security Copilot, at least in this case, only tells you what happened. It doesn't tell you what you should do about it. Now, I'm guessing that it's probably capable of telling you what to do about it. You know, if you were to enter a query like, hey, I just had this attack happen, what should my next steps be? My guess is it would probably produce an answer, and probably a good one. But Microsoft doesn't actually show that, so I'm hesitant to say that, yes, it can tell you what to do about it. So Security Copilot is extremely useful. You already saw it break down the forensics of that particular attack. But it does have one major shortcoming that you need to know about. So this screen came from Microsoft's demo, and someone asked, are Windows devices impacted? And then it comes back and says Windows 11, Windows 10, and Windows 9 devices are not directly affected. So the problem is that there is no such thing as Windows 9, and yet Copilot is clearly referencing Windows 9. So the bottom line is that AI-generated content isn't perfect. This is something that Microsoft's been totally upfront about, and it's something that the industry as a whole has also acknowledged. So AI-generated content isn't perfect, at least not yet. It's something that will probably get better over time as Copilot receives additional training, but even then you're likely to run into things like that from time to time. So the point that I wanted to make regarding this is that there's been a huge amount of talk in recent months about IT professionals losing their jobs to AI. At least in this case, Security Copilot is not going to take the place of a trained security professional, because the information that Security Copilot produces is helpful, but you still need a human who is experienced in security to be able to read through what Security Copilot has produced and find out, and to clarify, yes, this is valid, or no, it's making a mistake here. Here's what this should be. So Security Copilot is presumably going to be getting better over time, but there's always the risk of these types of mistakes. So I think having a human in the loop is always going to be required. So with that said, I've covered a huge amount of material, but I want to go ahead and take a few minutes for questions and answers.
Yeah, we got some good ones. And thanks, Brian, for assuring us we aren't losing our jobs quite yet. Let's kick it off with a couple of multi-factor authentication questions. First one comes in from Santiago. What is the best practice for the break the glass account regarding MFAs?
My advice would be don't enable MFA for break glass accounts, because if things are so dire that you're having to use that break glass account, then something's gone horribly wrong. And if that thing that's gone horribly wrong just happens to be a problem with multi-factor authentication, and your break glass account requires multi-factor authentication, then it could be game over at that point. So my recommendation would be to put as few restrictions on that break glass account as possible. And that's the reason why I recommend having such a strong password associated with it, and only having one copy of that password and put it in a super secure place where you don't have to worry about it becoming compromised.
Okay, great advice. The next one comes from Sandra. If we are enabling MFA using conditional access policies instead of security defaults, is there any way to increase our secure score, since when using CAA for MFA, it's not recognized as having MFA enabled?
Your secure score isn't a be-all, end-all. Watching the number go up doesn't really mean all that much, aside from giving you a warm fuzzy, if you're to be completely frank about it. One thing that you can do is the items that are listed in Secure Score, they're clickable. And when you click on one of those items, you can tell it this is something that's planned for, it's something I've already addressed, it's something that's not going to be addressed. I forget the actual terminology that Microsoft uses. But I believe if you decide not to do something, I think the designation is accepted risk. So if you go ahead and flag that, then Secure Score is not going to be constantly nagging you about that. I'm not sure if that will be reflected in the score or not. I've never actually tried it, but that may be one way to get Secure Score to not worry about it.
Okay, great. Joe wants to know, is there a cost for audit logging?
To the best of my knowledge, no. There's a chance that it may count against your Microsoft 365 storage, but as far as just going in and turning it on, I'm not aware of any cost.
Let's stick with the cost questions. Michael has another one for you. Being an admin, if you have a non-privileged and privileged account, would not this require 2 licenses? This is cost prohibitive, he says.
Don't quote me on this. This is something you would want to check with Microsoft about. But the way that I understand it would be that if you've got one account that's only designated as an admin and you're only using that to perform administrative functions, then that account doesn't actually have to be licensed to use Microsoft 365 because you're not using the applications themselves, whereas your normal user account would be. That's my understanding of it, but you would want to check with whoever sells you your licenses just to make sure that that's right.
Okay, great. Is there a priority for conditional access policies?
Yeah, I believe that there is a mechanism that you can use to move items up and down the list so that if you have contradictory policies, you can choose which one takes precedence over the other. But as far as how to actually do that, it's something I would have to look up.
Okay, and George wants to know, can we configure alerts for risky users?
I believe so. Microsoft 365 does have something where it can identify risky users. There's a risky users mechanism and there's a risky logons mechanism, and they're both tied into conditional access policies. So I'm sorry, I kind of lost track. What was the question?
Can we set up alerts for risky users?
Yeah, all that's a way of saying I'm almost positive that you can.
Okay, great. I lied. We have one more pricing question for you. What are my options if I do not have an E5 subscription?
There are a couple of options. One is to just take full advantage of whatever security mechanisms exist in the subscription that you've got. Certainly E5 will give you better security, but it tends to be a bit more enterprise-oriented. So the lesser subscriptions do have security features baked in, even if they're not quite as comprehensive. Another option is if you've got an E3 account, there's a security add-on that you can associate with it, so you don't have to upgrade to E5. You can do what they call E3 plus security. So that's another option.
Okay, what should my top priority be with regards to securing Microsoft 365?
My top priority would probably be to do a full assessment. Take a look. SecureScore is a great place to start, but take a look at what's enabled, what's not enabled, and try to get a sense of where any vulnerabilities might lie. Once you do that, you can get a sense of what security features need to be turned on, or if you're needing to maybe purchase a third-party security tool or upgrade to a higher subscription in order to get the level of security that you need.
Okay, let's do one more question and wrap it up. As an MSP, what is the best way to manage multiple Microsoft 365 organizations?
Yeah, managing multi-tenant environments, it's a little bit out of my league. I'm not really sure.
Okay, then we will, let's close with this one instead. Are there security advantages of businesses premium over Entra ID P1 with business standard?
Ooh, there's so many different subscription plans. I'm not even really sure without looking it up what's included in those particular plans.
Okay, let's just wrap it there then. Thanks for the great talk, Brian.
Yeah, not a problem. Thank you for having me.